As someone who has only read the first 9 chapters of JoJo's Stillborn run about a year ago, I noticed that some manga scenes were cut out from the first episode. Now, that doesn't make it a bad episode. It had to trim some content to keep the pacing smooth while covering the entire first stage of the race. So in today's video, we're going to look at which manga scenes didn't make it into episode 1. But before we start, here's what I'll be covering when comparing the manga and anime. Future content and no spoilers. If something from the manga isn't shown in the anime yet, but could appear later, I will mention that it exists, but not explain the details or the outcomes of the content. So shout out to my anime only viewers out there, since if I were to click on a video like this, I wouldn't want any spoilers either. Cut content. If a manga scene is clearly removed and unlikely to appear later, I will show it and explain what's happening. Reordered scenes. If a scene happens at a different time in the anime compared to the manga, I will point it out and explain why it may have been changed. Important changes. I'll mainly focus on important changes that affect the story, characters or pacing, but if a smaller change is interesting, funny or worth mentioning, I may include it. Dialogue changes. I won't mention small dialogue changes unless they change the meaning, tone or how a character feels. Anyways, those are the differences that I'll be covering. The first episode adapts the first 11 chapters of the manga with the first page of the 12th chapter. But without further ado, let's begin. At the start of the chapter, we're introduced to Sandman, just like in the anime. However, the anime only shows him running and hiding in a cave, while the manga includes a few extra moments that were skipped here. Now these scenes are pretty important and will most likely be shown later, so I'm not going to spoil them here. In the anime, we see Mr. Steel holding the press conference first, and then breaking down in his office with Lucy. In the manga, it's actually the opposite, as we see him in the office first, followed by the press conference. In the manga, the office scene shows a worker telling Mr. Steel about all the complaints from the guests before the race, such as poo overflowing in the toilet, a lack of supplies, fight breaking out, and overall poor conditions. In response, he increases the budget to try and fix everything, which leads into him breaking down with Lucy, worrying that the race might fail before it even begins. However, in the anime, this interaction doesn't exist, but it still keeps that emotional moment by changing the context slightly, by tying it to a question during the press conference about what would happen if no one finishes the race and how investors might react. This cut was most likely done to improve pacing. During the press conference, the anime trims down a lot of extra information from the manga. Things like the full prize pool, entry requirements, and a few additional questions. Most of that isn't too important, so it makes sense that it was cut for pacing. At the end of the press conference, Mr. Steel gets asked a question involving Lucy in the manga, but since it could be important later on, I'm gonna leave that out for now. At the start of chapter 2, the manga shows a flashback of Poco Loco before he even enters the Stillborn Run race. However, the anime moved this moment right before Poco Loco jumps over the ravine, mainly for pacing since it's still focused on Gyro's introduction here. At the end of chapter 2, Johnny says this is the story of how he begins to walk. The anime moves this moment to the end of episode 1, which works better for pacing and makes sense as a closing line for the first episode. In the anime, we first see Johnny chasing after Gyro, trying to touch his steel balls.
Please let me touch it again! I can pay you! Hey yo, what the fuck?
Then we get his backstory explaining why he's in the wheelchair. In the manga, chapter 3 starts with Johnny's backstory first, then shows him chasing Gyro. This change in the anime makes sense as it makes us curious about why he's in the wheelchair and wouldn't give us a weird awkward flashback scene right before he chases Gyro. However, the content of Johnny's backstory was changed. In the anime, we learn he had a brother, Nicholas, who died in an accident. The manga never mentions a brother, but instead shows a scene of Johnny visiting a millionaire's house where he and the millionaire's daughter and her friend had... Yep, they smashed. My boy was a player, but I guess it makes sense why they removed that from the anime. There's also a small difference in the line cutting scene. In the manga, Johnny is hesitant and doesn't seem to enjoy cutting in front of everyone. However, in the anime, it cuts that hesitation and makes him look more like a jerk, likely to keep the pacing tight. Finally, the old man kicking Johnny is an anime only scene. It doesn't affect the story, but Johnny had it coming for pushing an old man, so I wanted to include that in. At the start of this chapter, it's mentioned that there are 3,500 participants in the race, which the anime doesn't mention, as it's not essential information. The manga also shows a small interaction between Gyro and Sandman, where Sandman asks Gyro where to sign up, with Gyro pointing in a direction. However, the anime skips this to keep the pacing tight and just shows Sandman already at the sign-up location. Also, the emerald that Sandman gives has a backstory, but its story behind it ties in with something from chapter 1, so I'll skip over that for now. Before Johnny gets on his horse, the manga includes an announcement that each horse's number is the starting grid number, and the first place trophy is encased in ice that's 300 million years old and will only be melted once someone finishes the race, but this was cut as it's not necessary to know and to keep the pacing tight. Before chapter 4 and 5, there is an anime only scene of Johnny wiping his blood from his head, but in the manga, for the whole first race, there was blood from his head the whole time. And this was cut because coloring that red would be more tedious for the staff. We also got to see the reactions of the two riders being shocked that Johnny got on his horse, while in the manga, that didn't happen. Which also isn't a big change, but I thought it's really cool how in the anime they showed that. After Jaro eliminated Abdo in the anime, we see Poco Loco realizing he is late to the race. However, in the manga, we see Poco Loco's reaction at the end of this chapter, after Diego is stopped at the bridge. This change was to make the pacing feel smoother, because after Diego is stopped at the bridge in the anime, we see Poco Loco caught up already to the group, so it would be pretty awkward if they show him missing the start of the race, just for him to be there in the next scene. In the anime, when Poco Loco catches up to the other riders, it instantly transitions to him at the cliff. However, in the manga, Poco Loco has a series of unlucky but lucky events while catching up to the other riders. For example, we see horse crap fly onto his face, which is a pretty shitty situation, but in this case it's lucky because hidden under the poo was a $100 coin. Other riders around him had poo fly on them, one of them being a girl who undressed herself to get rid of the poo, but that allowed Poco Loco to get a peek of some watermelons. Then he turned around and figured out that the person next to him was a criminal that had a bounty of $500, meaning that he can turn him in to win that prize money. All of these events made him have more faith in his luck, while the anime handles this differently by using a flashback of his past to show why he trusts his luck. This part was cut out because it would take up a lot of time in the episode. In the manga, we see Poco Loco getting attacked by other riders, but in the anime, this doesn't happen for pacing reasons, but hey, at least they compensated with this "our mom is kind of homeless" face. There's also a difference in how Poco Loco falls off his horse. In the anime, he's knocked off after Jaro manipulates the trees to close in on him, whereas in the manga, he initially falls after running into a tree himself. However, a similar moment does happen later in the manga, where Jaro uses the trees near the end of the forest to eliminate Poco Loco, but this plan fails as it helps Poco Loco recover back up onto his horse, while in the anime, he gets up from his pure strength, so all of that forest shenanigans was cut to make the pacing tighter. In the anime, when Poco Loco was going down a hill, he hears a voice questioning if he's scared, followed up by the older lady telling him he shouldn't be scared and nor hesitant about his luck. But in the manga, it is completely different and will definitely be mentioned later, so I'm gonna skip over that for now. In the manga, we see the crowd on the train reacting to Sandman taking first place, while in the anime, this is mostly conveyed to the commentator instead, to keep the pacing tight. Manga also includes a short explanation from Mr. Still about Sandman's running style, which the anime skips, likely for pacing. There's also an additional Poco Loco moment in the manga, but since it ties in with something that happened in the last chapter, I won't go into detail here as it will be a spoiler. In the anime, when he says this line, his horse accelerates and goes in front of Diego, while in the manga, after he says that line, his horse kicks Ross at Diego's face and horse, which helps show his skill as a professional rider, and to be honest, I don't know why this was cut. There's also another Poco Loco moment that the anime skips, because it's tied to the events in chapter 10 and 11. Additionally, the manga includes an internal monologue from Sandman, but this wasn't adapted in the anime, because it's tied again with stuff that happens from chapter 1. And that's pretty much it, so hopefully you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments below which change was your favorite, which change was your least favorite, and I hope you have a wonderful day, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!